Educators, parents, and students are all poised for the beginning of summer. For many, it will be a welcome respite from the most unusual school year in living memory. From virtual school to on again, off again, in-class learning this year, and maybe next, to what the long-term effects might be, it's been tough. With us now for more, in Mississauga, Ontario, Diana Wang-Martin, high school chemistry teacher in the Peel District School Board. And in the provincial capital in Liberty Village, Jay Williams, a middle school elementary teacher of math, science, history, and geography in the Toronto District School Board. And in downtown of the capital city, Prachi Srivas-tava, professor specializing in education and global development at Western University, and Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, assistant professor and program coordinator for Wilfrid Laurier University's Law and Society program. And we're delighted to welcome all of you back to our program. And just before we start our discussion, and in the interest of full disclosure, TVO has been part of the province's delivery of distance learning since it was created in 1970. Today, TVO offers online secondary school courses through what's called the Independent Learning Centre, the ILC, and it's been asked by the province to help implement a provincial online learning system in Ontario. So we get that out there in the interest of full disclosure. I want to start, if I can, with the two I was going to say two teachers. You're all teachers, but I mean those who are in the elementary and secondary panel. Jay, to you first. I know we all tend to focus on the bad news, but let's start maybe with some good news. What was the one thing about this past year that actually kind of surprised you because it went surprisingly well?
You know, just how resilient our students really are. They were faced, as you mentioned, with insurmountable situations in which, you know, they could have easily folded. But what they showed to me specifically is, again, just how resilient they are and able to bounce back when we had to pivot, return to school, pivot again, but really shine through and really lead this opportunity for things to be great this school year.
Okay, Diana, what would you add to that in terms of what surprised you because it actually was okay?
I would have to agree with Jay, is the resilience and the grit of the students. They went through so much this year. It was so exhausting for everybody, but they stuck through it, and they actually, you know, did learn some things, and you know, they were very, very resilient, and I'm very, very proud of them.
All right, Jay, you know I'm going to look at the other side of the coin now. What stunk about the past year?
A lot. To be very honest and very frank with you, a lot was difficult. As I mentioned before, we've had to pivot multiple times. The uncertainty of which we were faced, returning to school, online, virtual school, emergency learning, looking back at last year's class, students really struggled emotionally, physically, their overall well-being. It was difficult for them to learn. In talking to them over the past couple of days, about what they're looking forward to next year. They're just looking for some stability. They're looking to engage with their peers in class again. And all of that was missing this year for them. And I truly understand how difficult it was a year for them.
Diana, for you, the worst part of the past year?
Well, many students and teachers were in the hybrid model. And that was the model with, you know, students in class and online at the same time. It was very difficult for students, both in class and online, to be learning at the same time. And it was very difficult for teachers to teach both groups of students at the same time. So that was very, very difficult.
And a quick follow-up with you, Diana. I mean, you kind of joked a moment ago that they learned, although maybe not all that much. What part, you got a guess about what percentage of the curriculum you just didn't get to this year?
I would say I probably had to put aside about a quarter of the curriculum, to be honest. I wanted to make sure that they learned well the content that they did. And because of that, I had to put aside a quarter, approximately, the content.
Jay, how does that compare to your experience?
I would have to agree. That's a pretty safe answer. A quarter would probably be left out. However, I would say I touched on as much as I could. I focused on student interest and student voice as much as possible. Also focused on much of what was happening in and around the world. And that, I think, drove my class, my teaching, and my connections to the curriculum this year.
All right, let's get some feedback from the two post-secondary people now. Prachi, you've heard what these two educators have to say. What's your initial reaction to what you've heard?
Well, I think firstly, teachers are the stars of this year. Thank you so much for your service. And I'm well aware of all of the issues, the issues that households have been facing, that students have been facing, that teachers have been facing. And all of this, in my mind, really comes down to insufficient planning. It comes down to insufficient planning from the provincial level. And given that many of us were warning, raising serious concerns, since I would say at least since last summer, but I had started working on this since last March. It's really somewhat inexcusable that we are here in Ontario in a high resource context, and we've suffered the longest school closures in Canada. And actually, we've suffered the longest in North America and Europe, if you look at the average globally. So that's quite shocking. I think our system and, in terms of systems planning, was just not firstly prepared. And secondly, when there were issues in terms of thinking about what we should be doing regarding the exigencies of this year, that just wasn't clear. And so we're in a situation where educators, school boards, schools did really the best they could within circumstances that were unprecedented. And if we look at other contexts, we're actually much worse than other contexts in the way that we dealt with education in this province.
All right, much to follow up on there, and we will. Kelly, let me get your initial reaction, first of all, though, to what you heard from our two educators.
Well, I think that they talked about some of the most important challenges that face teachers and the biggest reward and emotionally compelling part, which is the experience of students. It makes sense that teachers have had to adapt, and I agree with Prachi that the level of adaptation of the teaching workforce in Ontario is extraordinary, and many other places as well. So the capacity to have to throw out your existing engaged pedagogy. Imagine for very young children, if you've run a play-based classroom with lots of stations, and all of a sudden you are delivering through sort of this direct two-way transmission, staring up at a screen full of cameras off, students trying to engage socially, knowing the importance of relationships, knowing the importance of in-depth engaged learning, more than just one specific chunk of knowledge. I think that's been tremendous. And then doing it in the context of constant turnarounds, a policy framework, particularly introducing this concept of parental choice that only happened in Alberta and Ontario, which segregated and resplit classes and caused us to have much more churn and disruption than other places. There have been numerous specific problems with the way in which education policy unrolled in Ontario this year. The classic line of Ontario education policy comes back from Mike Harris. John Snowblin, the then education minister, said, let's create a crisis in education. It wasn't good. And what we have here is a crisis from the outside, and a government that either hasn't coped with it or has been trying to take advantage of it for ideological reasons.
Prachi, I'm going to follow up with one of the things that you said, and that was the decision to close schools for longer than any other jurisdiction in North America. Here's Premier Ford's explanation. The Premier said, we have the biggest international airport in the country in Toronto, Mississauga actually, and therefore it's really tough to keep a handle on things. We have among the most densely populated parts of the country in the Greater Toronto Area, and that made it difficult to keep a handle on things. And as a result, he said, had I not closed the schools, things would have been just that much worse. Your view?
So this is not a view. This is what I'm going to say is actually not a view. It's based on data. It's based on international and global experience. The issue around mitigation of the virus, I think most of the viewers now, having probably been following the story over the last year, can probably attest to the fact that controlling the virus is really you need a number of levels of control. You need macro measures, you need community level measures, and you need school level mitigation measures. And when the macro and community level measures are simply insufficient, we will see transmission in our communities, and that will drive transmission in our schools. And the schools have done the best they can in terms of mitigating at the level of schools, but that cannot really be sufficient if the macro measures are not there. We talk about densely populated countries. Vietnam has roughly 90 million people, and it is a low middle income country. And it did what it did in terms of controlling the transmission at the level of the community last year, such that the schools have relatively been open pretty much since April of 2020. I mean, these are actual mitigation strategies that are put into place to crush the virus at the beginning. Contact tracing, looking very strongly in terms of test, trace, isolate, and being very clear about mobility restrictions. All of these are the kinds of measures that are at the level of macro measures. Then we talk about things like subsidizing our businesses. We might want to look at paid sick leave. All of these, I know it sounds so far removed when we're looking at education, but honestly, if you want to treat certain sectors as essential, we have to put in mitigation measures at the level of community and at the level of macro measures so that we can actually control successfully at the level of schools. Now, at the point that we're at, or we were at perhaps in May or April, it may have seemed that there was no other option at that point. But that's not because this was a natural evolution of the disease in terms of how it was spread. That is because sincere policy measures at the macro and community levels were not put into place in a way so as to protect education as an essential service, as an essential sector. We could look at our neighboring province of Quebec, for example, that did things very differently from January, that introduced a pilot program for families in high alpha variant boroughs, so that all parents and teachers who were in those boroughs got vaccinated by priority. You know, there are things that one can do if one actually wants to protect education as a sector. And I think that is really the point. And I'm sure that over the next couple of years, there will be quite a lot of scrutiny when the dust has settled to really understand at what point did we lose the policy game. It's not a game. And I think that's really the sadness, is that using schools as the primary lever, we can see did not work very well in Ontario, when other countries, other contexts did other things to protect education and schooling.
In which case, I'll get Kelly to follow up on that by saying, I'd like you to speak to the issue of insufficient planning. If there had been, in your view, better planning, more effective planning, what would that have looked like as opposed to what ended up transpiring?
Well, I think one of the most critical demands that have come from the sector over time and that we still need is a collaborative approach to education planning that includes all the key stakeholders and that happens at least partly in public so that we understand that there's a real concern about how do we make things better going forward. We have not had a multi-stakeholder table. We have not had education expertise being brought forward. We have not had the data to target where there's the highest educational risk. And we saw how data informed our vaccination strategy. We do not see any kind of data-oriented planning around our education strategy. And that's a really big problem. And again, we fall short of global standards, including those that are considered adequate for low and middle income countries, around sampling and testing and having some idea how kids are doing at the system level. I'm sure the teachers know their own kids, but we don't have a system read. And we need that both to tackle discrimination, to target resources for the vulnerable, and to make the case when we're seeing a sort of a tension, perhaps imaginary, but multiple directions of tension between health and learning and the economy. We need to be able to make our own case in the education space about the importance of what we're doing, the importance of how kids learn, their learning environments, and we don't have any of those things. So when we look at how we would plan for a better future, Prachi and I and colleagues from U of T and Ryerson wrote a report for the Science Advisory Table on education disruption in Ontario this year. And our report really highlighted sort of the range of very complex issues that need to be tackled to think through the education space. But we need a proactive plan that's focused on vulnerable students, because we know that the gaps that probably occurred this year, if we look at the evidence from everywhere else in the world, did occur this year. Wouldn't it be nice if we had data here? We know that those aren't evenly distributed. So we need a plan that puts the vulnerable at the center of the picture. And we need a plan that goes forward. We're at the end of June. We don't know what the fall is going to look like. We haven't seen big investments in education, recognizing that there's been disruption and harm. And I can't believe it. Like, I am shocked. When you look at how other countries are responding, we are months behind where we should be.
Okay, Jay, I want to follow up with you on this issue of could the schools have been open more from this particular angle. A decision was made, for better or for worse, that teachers need not be prioritized in terms of getting vaccinations. And as a result, teachers sort of were in the queue like everybody else. Do you believe, Jay, that had teachers been prioritized and therefore at the front of the list to get vaccinated, that A, they would have taken up that offer, and B, you could have kept the schools open longer?
I would have to lean towards saying, yes, that is the case. Just from conversations in my own circle with my peers and my colleagues, the fear was high, anxiety was high in terms of just contracting the virus at school. Measures, obviously, has been stated in this conversation, were not put in place to protect teachers, to protect students as well, and staff in schools. We did the best that we could, but unfortunately, it just was not a feeling of feeling comfortable and feeling safe for most of us. So going back to your question, if we were prioritized in the beginning like we should have, like it seems other countries and other locations did prioritize their educational workers and teachers, schools very well could have been open.
Diana, can I get your sense on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jay. I got my first and second doses at the same time as everyone else. I might have been a little bit earlier in my first dose, but the second dose with everyone else. They really did not. I feel that the province did not put in the proper plan, did not go with the proper planning to make schools safe. Doug Ford sent out a letter to his stakeholders in the spring that basically admitted that schools were the main and biggest sources of COVID outbreak in the province. So that says a lot.
Well, I guess with that information in hand, you got two choices. Shut them down or vaccinate like crazy to make sure that they're not. They went for the former instead of the latter. You think they made the wrong call?
They needed to vaccinate everyone. They also needed to put in place safety measures that they did not.
Okay, Prachi, you want in on that?
I think there are some issues in terms of, there's two things. There's first making sure that the schools are in a safer context. And I think that is primarily one of the issues that many of us had been actually arguing for since last summer. And many of those measures, primarily the ventilation measures and the smaller class sizes, these were really seen as public health measures. They were politicized beyond all recognition. But both from a pedagogical and from a safety perspective, those are good things to do. When you have an airborne virus transmission, you want to reduce human contact. You want to make sure that the schools have good ventilation. I think that's one of the number one issues. But then the second issue is one that we allude to in our report, which is really about looking at the education continuity measures, right? Because we're looking into fall now, we're looking into fall of 2021, and the education continuity and remediation measures are just not there. You know, the things that we know in terms of emergency education literature, and there is a rather large field, this idea that we don't know what to do because the virus took us by surprise is actually discourse that's used to legitimize inefficient and insufficient policy. We actually do know what to do in emergency education circumstances. We do know what to do when there are pandemics like Ebola, like Zika. We actually do know what to do in terms of education. And what we need to do are three things. The first thing, we need to look at our curriculum and really understand, as Diana and Jay both have said, that there were parts of the curriculum that were missed. That's not because of lack of effort or because the teachers don't want to teach it. It's because it's unable to be met in the same way, given this pivoting and also given the problems that students have been having in a range of areas. So we look at the curriculum for every single year from JK until grade 12, and we see what parts of the curriculum need to be lengthened, what parts of the curriculum need to be moved into the next year, what parts of the curriculum need to be put in from the previous year into this current year. And you need to do that for the entire system. The second thing you need is you need to have core boosting of core skills for every student in every grade, and add psychosocial programming for every single child, because we know that there have been issues in both of those areas. And then the third thing we need to do is to have targeted interventions for the most disrupted, for children that now have new vulnerabilities, that had existing vulnerabilities that have been deepened. All of that requires resources, and it requires comparable data, of which we do not have. It also requires collaborative planning, stakeholder participation, which has not been implemented. And these, to me, are really the kinds of discussions we need to be having for September. And we need to do that for 2 years. The things that I'm saying are not off the top of my head. They really are looking at the literature for the last 20 years and understanding what we do when there is a mass long-term education disruption.
Well, let me follow up with Kelly on one of the things that you just said there, which is critically important, and that is data. Kelly, in a normal year, we'd be getting EQAO testing for grades 3, 6, and 9, and you could actually follow the progress of students year over year, schools versus schools, and so on and so forth. I guess for understandable reasons, they decided not to do that this year because, of course, you'd be comparing apples and oranges. What the kids were able to learn this year compared to previous non-pandemic years just would not have been the same. The downside of that is we don't have, I gather, good data for what did in fact transpire this year, and therefore we don't really know what the kids learned or didn't, or how much catching up they've got to do, et cetera, et cetera. I basically throw that as a sort of a big pile of you know what to you and say, discuss.
Right. Well, Ontario has a long-standing data shortage, and it's really important that when we think about educational success, we think beyond literacy and numeracy. There are multiple strategies, there are multiple indicators we need to really understand how our system's working. We need equity indicators, we need race-based data, we need measures of key school processes like attendance, and yeah, we do need some literacy and numeracy information as well. The recommendation from UNESCO, from Data Quality Matters, is that we have sample-based testing with an oversampling of vulnerable students. And that would help us take the temperature. That would make it undeniable what's happening in our schools. Because I did a review of 15 large-scale assessments happening all over the world, but particularly in the US and in England. And there's no question that we can do this. We can use teacher diagnostic assessments aggregated to give us a picture. So in the US, one study of about 3 million students using standard teacher diagnostic assessments that you'd use at the beginning of the school year to figure out your reading program for students showed that there was a 40% increase in the number of kids who were 2 years behind just after the first closure of last year. We're a year later. We don't know what's happened since. We don't know whether the remote schooling worked or to what extent, and all the effort and money that went into doing remote schooling, we don't know whether that worked. And we have a really major problem if we can't see where there's problems, who's most affected, and understand, particularly, I think we now know we really need to keep an eye on systemic discrimination and how these patterns are working out for different groups of people. I find it very worrying that we know that the places where the most parents chose to go into remote schooling, that those are disproportionately low income, disproportionately racialized groups where we've got data.
Without
and
great
that data was
Wi-Fi
collected
either.
by journalists. Huge Wi-Fi issues, an enormous issue for rural Ontario. Enormous. In Toronto, it's not great at all. And there's technology issues like computers without mics. So kids have done their whole year on chat. There's all kinds of technological problems, but the technology is sort of the least of the problems. The genuine digital access is actually a bit social, as is learning. And kids going the whole year without being able to see each other, make new friends. I have a daughter who started grade 9 this year, and she's pretty social, and she made no new friends this year. It's been a really challenging year. We're not going to get data on that, but we should have some data on kids' well-being. And it should be looking well beyond issues of virus transmission.
Well, Jay, let's look ahead to next year then. Are you operating under the assumption that both you and all your students will be back in the classroom come September?
Yeah, 100%. That is the hope. In speaking to them even earlier this morning, we discussed what their thoughts are about fall, about September. And they're all anxious to be in class, understandably, as am I. They are looking forward to graduating middle school and moving on to high school, but having a normal school year again, participating in extracurriculars like sports and clubs and teams, but also being able, as Kelly mentioned, to be with their peers and be social and not have to stay in these bubbles that they've been required to stay in during lunchtime, which is not natural, right? Not being able to play basketball in the back of the school because of the fear of transmission of everyone touching the same basketball. Like, I can't imagine going to school and having to experience that right now.
Were you able to do any extracurriculars at all this past year?
There were clubs that were virtual, robotics club. I had a boys group that I met with briefly, but even that deteriorated over time just because of lack of engagement, being virtual again. I'm used to doing those types of things in person and engaging with my young boys through interpersonal connections.
I guess there's only so much screen time you can expect of, people of that age, right? Of any of us, for that matter.
Of course.
Yeah.
Myself included, exactly.
Yeah. Diana, maybe you could follow up on that. How about extracurriculars for you? Were you able to do anything in your school?
I did do a little bit of extracurricular. It went all right. Everything was obviously online. The kids did what they were able to within the confines of, the virtual environment. So there, a little bit of extracurricular happened, obviously not to the extent that it would normally.
And Diana, if everybody is operating under the assumption that education will be back in the classroom, teachers and students, educational assistants, everybody, come the fall, what do you want to see happen to be confident that it's going to be good, safe, appropriate, etc.?
Well, first of all, it's not looking to be a normal year next year. The current plan for next year is that we will be continuing the hybrid model in many boards. It'll be a combination of quads and semesters. My understanding in next year, students will be online, the ones that are online, and also the ones in classroom will be learning for 2.5 hours straight in the morning, followed by 1 hour lunch, and then 2.5 hours straight in the afternoon. That's a lot of time straight through for kids to learn. I am very worried that they are going to be more exhausted next year than they have been this year. In terms of keeping everyone safe in the school, they need to get the ventilation system properly worked through. I think the kids still need to wear masks inside the school. The studies out of Israel have shown that when the masks were not required, the COVID cases went up. So, yeah, I don't think it'll be a normal year, but to keep everyone safe, we need to make sure that the ventilation system is proper and in place.
Okay, I'm going to get Prachi to follow up on what you've just said. Prachi, if we can get, a good critical mass of people vaccinated, teachers and students, if they can improve the vaccination systems, if the ventilation systems, if they can manage to focus on those three things that you talked about a while ago, getting the curriculum right, the boosting of the core skills, the interventions where appropriate, in your view, is there any reason why everybody can't be back in the classroom come fall?
I am a hopeful person by nature, but we cannot run a system on hope alone. I think these interventions that have been discussed today are key. I think the fact that 12 to 17-year-olds will also be vaccinated is also key. But one of the things we really do need is consistent, transparent, collaborative planning. We've been asking, many of us, I've been asking for a task force since March of 2020. I don't understand how it is possible that we are now going into a potentially third academic year of disruption. And we're still at a point where at the end of June, we really don't have a very clear strategy. I'm going to give an example just because I've been working with the G20 engagement group, and I'm leading a policy brief for G20 countries on education, recovery, and rebuilding. I did last year. I'm doing it again. Scotland had two groups focusing specifically on education and children's issues. One was like a subgroup of something similar to we have here. For example, we have the science table. They have a COVID group, and there was a subgroup of that was focused specifically on education and children's issues. And it had the top-notch experts, public health experts, educators, medics, researchers, looking at exactly the kind of questions around transmission, around children's issues, mental health issues, and advising the government in terms of how to come up with a strategy for schools and schooling. The second group they have is an education recovery group, and that one is specifically with teachers, educators, head teachers, which would be known as principals here, looking to how to actually implement the strategies for education continuity. It is not impossible to do. We can do that, but it requires will. And it requires strong political will in order to do that and to organize that. And at the end of the day, I'm going to end here, is that education systems are really a reflection of our values. They are a reflection of our collective values in society. I think the travesties that we are seeing in terms of now trying to reckon with what's been happening with the residential schools tells us that our education systems are fundamentally a reflection of our society. And if we fundamentally believe that this is an essential service, that this is going to be the cornerstone, the bedrock of our future, we need to be planning in a way that is serious, that is cogent, that takes into consideration the safety issues, but also the issues around really understanding that 2.1 million citizens of our province, that is the elementary and secondary students of our province, have been denied a basic right to education for now going into a third academic year. That to me is inexcusable sitting here in Ontario in Canada. I just cannot understand it.
Well, I totally hear what you're saying, but Kelly, I'm going to get you to follow up with this. The demands on the public purse have been and are going to continue to be enormous going forward. And I'm thinking of all the people right now. What did the Financial Accountability Officer say the other day? There are literally millions upon millions of elective surgical procedures, diagnostic tests, and so on that have been backlogged as a result of the lack of access to healthcare services over the course of the past 15 months. And the government's been told it'll cost $1.5 billion to clear that backlog. Well, the government's put half that money forward so far. That suggests that, there's more to come there. How do we how are we going to manage all this, I guess, is the short question, because there's tons of demands everywhere for more and better.
Yeah, there is, and there should be, because if we fail to invest now in meaningful educational recovery, it is likely to lead to long-term economic harm. So one of the key findings in our report was an estimate of how much we might expect that students' lifetime earnings would be adversely affected by the pandemic. And if we very conservatively assume that kids had sort of a third of a year of skills loss over the last 15 months, and that is conservative and an average, which is very unequal, then that would suggest likely a 3% drop in lifetime earnings. And it's going to hurt our GDP because well-educated kids have a key role to play in terms of solving our great big problems for the next generation, because we know this isn't our last great big problem. We've still got climate change ahead of us. We've still got all kinds of collective challenges. We need to learn to work together to solve those problems. And we know that it's also an economic issue. So it's like a $1.6 trillion price tag expected as just from the skills loss associated. So let's put some money up front, and let's take a look. Netherlands has put over $4,000 per student. The US, not big spenders on education, $2,700 per student next year. Ontario, $72 if you look at their learning. These are just the investments in learning and social and mental health.
So we got to join that parade.
I can't believe that we're failing to invest. And there are some more economical approaches with strong evidence base behind them. I think looking at high dose tutoring in support of teachers, maybe making use of all these graduates we have coming out of our universities who want to give back to society or willing to commit. I think that the AmeriCorps tutor program would be a terrific model for us to look at very seriously to try and help support teachers. Because if we want extracurriculars next year, and I really do, and sports and all those things that help kids re-engage at school, we need to recognize we don't pay teachers to do it. They do it out of the sense of what it takes to make a great education. Well, if teachers are stuck trying to fill every old gap they can manage with a much wider range of abilities in the classroom, and they're doing it on their own with no new resources, how are they also going to have the energy to start up those extracurriculars? They don't happen by magic. They happen by the dedicated professionals in our school.
I got to jump in here. You'll forgive me because we're plumb out of time, and we got to get you four back yet again because you always impart such good wisdom when you join us. Kelly, Prachi, Diana, Jay, thanks so much, and be well, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.